Today we're tackling a really interesting question, I think, about how our environment might be impacting the very young.
Mm-hmm.
We've got a scientific study here that dug into a possible connection between, well, a chemical many of us have heard of, bisphenol A, or BPA,
Right.
specifically in mothers after they've given birth, and how their preschool kids develop those, crucial thinking skills we call executive function.
Exactly. And we're looking at a peer-reviewed study from PubMed. The title is Postnatal BPA is associated with increasing executive function difficulties in preschool children. Good stuff.
Yeah.
This work comes from researchers at the University of Calgary, University of Alberta, Stockholm University, and also the APRIN study team.
APRIN, right? That's the Alberta Pregnancy Outcomes and Nutrition Study. Big long-term project.
That's the one, tracking mothers and their kids over time.
Okay, so let's try and unpack this a bit. We know BPA is, well, it's everywhere, right? In plastics, can linings.
Yeah, loads of things.
And this study also looked at bisphenol S, BPS, which is often used as a replacement for BPA.
Right, the substitute.
So, what the researchers really wanted to know was whether the levels of these chemicals in mothers, specifically after childbirth, could that be linked to how their kids' executive functions changed, say, between ages 2 and 4.
And that's a key developmental window.
Wow.
When we talk about executive function in preschoolers, it's really about those early cognitive skills, the ones that help them manage their behavior, their thoughts.
Okay.
We're focusing on three main areas here. First, inhibitory self-control. That's, the ability to stop yourself from doing something impulsive.
Like grabbing a toy, maybe.
Exactly, or waiting your turn. Then there's flexibility, how well a child can switch gears, move between different tasks or ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, something called emergent metacognition. It sounds complex, but it's really just the beginning of a child's awareness of their own thinking, starting to figure out how they solve problems.
Got it. So our goal for you listening today is to really understand the key takeaways from this research. What does it actually tell us about how these early thinking skills develop?
Mm-hmm.
And could this, common chemical exposure play a role? We want to get the insights without getting totally lost in the scientific details.
Absolutely. We're aiming for clarity. And just for context, scientists are generally quite concerned about how early life exposures to various chemicals might affect development. It's a growing field.
Right.
This study zeroed in on BPA and BPS because, well, as you said, they're just so common in everyday products.
And the researchers, they must have had a specific idea they were testing. What was their hypothesis, their main guess?
Yeah, they did. Their hypothesis was that early exposure to BPA and BPS would be associated with sex-dependent changes in these preschool executive functions.
Sex-dependent.
Yeah.
So they expected boys and girls might react differently.
That was their hunch, yeah. That the effect wouldn't necessarily be the same across the board.
Interesting. So they thought maybe boys and girls would be affected differently. How did they actually test this? What data did they use?
So they tapped into that APRIN cohort we mentioned earlier, the Alberta pregnancy study. They had data on 312 child pairs.
Okay.
And what's really key here is when they measured the chemical levels, they collected urine samples from the mothers during the second trimester of pregnancy.
Right, the prenatal exposure.
But also, crucially, around 3 months after the mothers gave birth, the postnatal period. And they tested these samples for BPA and BPS.
Okay, so prenatal and postnatal levels. And then how do they measure the kid's executive function? I mean, you can't exactly give a 2-year-old a written test on metacognition.
No, definitely not. They used a well-established tool called the Behavior Rating Inventory of Executive Function Preschool version. It's often shortened to BRIEF-P.
BRIEF-P. Okay.
It's basically a questionnaire. Mothers fill it out, reporting on their child's everyday behaviors related to these executive functions.
Ah, so it's based on parental observation.
Exactly. They did this when the children were 2 years old, and then again when they turned 4. It asks about things like, does the child act without thinking? How do they handle changes in routine? Do they seem aware of consequences? Things like that.
Right, real-world behaviors. And then the researchers looked at how the scores on this BRIEF-P changed between age 2 and 4, focusing on those 3 areas: inhibitory control, flexibility, and that emergent metacognition.
Precisely. They looked at changes in what are called standardized T-scores for those indexes. It's just a way to make the scores comparable across kids in time.
Okay.
And this is where it gets really, really interesting. The main finding, well, It was that the child's sex significantly moderated or influenced the link between the mother's postnatal BPA levels and these changes in executive function.
Okay, well, hang on. So the child's sex made a difference. How? What were the results?
Well, the study found that higher concentrations of BPA in the mother's urine samples taken after birth, that 3-month postpartum sample, those higher levels predicted increasing difficulties in inhibitory self-control and emergent metacognition, but only in the female children.
Wait, really? So more BPA in mom after birth was linked to girls having more trouble with self-control and that thinking about thinking skill as they went from 2 to 4?
That's what the data showed, yes. An increase in recorded difficulties for girls whose mothers had higher postnatal BPA.
That's a very specific finding and kind of concerning, isn't it?
It is. And what's just as important is that this association was not found in the male children.
Not at all.
Nope. Boys in the study didn't show that same relationship between their mother's postnatal BPA levels and changes in these specific executive functions.
Wow. That is a stark difference. Makes you wonder about the biological mechanisms, but okay. What about the other factors? Like BPS or the BPA levels during pregnancy?
Good questions. Interestingly, the prenatal BPA levels, the ones measured during the second trimester, they were not significant predictors of changes in executive function. Not for boys, not for girls.
Okay, so the timing, that postnatal window, seems key for BPA in this study.
It seems so. And similarly, for BPS, the BPA substitute, neither the prenatal nor the postnatal levels showed any significant links to changes in executive function for either sex.
So it really narrowed down to that postnatal BPA exposure, specifically in girls, for those particular skills.
According to the study's findings, yes, that was the standout result.
The study also mentions a figure 3, I think. Does that help illustrate this?
It does, yeah. Figure 3 basically provides a visual graph of these results. It shows the different trend lines, illustrating how that relationship between postnatal BPA and the changes in inhibitory control and emergent metacognition looks different for girls compared to boys. It just helps visualize the statistical finding.
Right, a picture of that sex difference. Okay, so stepping back, what does this all mean? What are the big picture implications here?
Well, the researchers basically concluded that postnatal BPA exposure might have this specific impact on the development trajectory of certain executive functions, namely inhibitory control and emergent metacognition in girls.
Okay.
And they make a really important point about the ubiquity of BPA exposure among breastfeeding women.
Ah, right, because if mothers have BPA in their system after birth and they're breastfeeding.
Exactly. That's a potential pathway for the infant to be exposed indirectly. The researchers highlight this isn't proven causation from breastfeeding in this study, but it's a very plausible route given how common BPA is.
That does raise significant questions, doesn't it? If BPA is so widespread and breastfeeding is the primary source of nutrition for many infants.
It does. The study states pretty clearly that these findings justify further investigation on the effects of postnatal bisphenol exposure on child cognitive development. They're calling for more research.
Makes sense.
And in their sort of impact summary, they emphasize that this work extends what we knew, suggesting that maternal BPA levels after birth, not just during pregnancy, could play a role in child executive function.
And it sounds like they're hinting, maybe, that we need to think about reducing potential exposure for infants.
That seems to be the implication. They suggest that additional precautions may be needed to potentially protect infants' neurodevelopment from indirect BPA exposure, especially because it's so commonly found in breastfeeding mothers.
Right.
And it's also worth mentioning they declared no conflicts of interest related to this study, which is always good to know.
Definitely. Okay, so let's try and boil this down for everyone listening. The key takeaway from this deep dive, really, is that this particular study points towards a potential connection between higher levels of BPA in moms after giving birth and their preschool daughters, specifically daughters showing increasing difficulties with self-control and their awareness of their own thinking between ages 2 and 4.
And crucially, not seeing that same link in sons.
Right. And also important, as you said, they didn't find these significant links with BPA levels during pregnancy itself, or with the substitute chemical BPS at either time point for either boys or girls in this cohort.
Yeah, the specificity is really notable here. Postnatal BPA, female children, inhibitory control, emergent metacognition. That was the pattern they observed.
So this really leaves us with a significant question for you, the listener, to think about. Given, how incredibly common BPA is in just our everyday environment. What further questions does this research spark for you, thinking about environmental exposures and how they might shape early development? And maybe what kind of future studies would help us truly understand these effects, especially these sex-specific differences they found?
Yeah, it definitely gives you something to chew on, doesn't it? Thinking about these subtle environmental influences and early development. Lots more to learn, for sure.